slides.
Okay.
This is just practice. And by the way, this is extemporaneous. As Monica realizes, I really didn't practice this because I feel as though I know this.
Yeah. Yeah, you wrote the book. Of course
Yeah.
you know it.
Right. And I did the slides, so sure I know it.
Yeah. All
But
right.
this is going to be so good to hear it from you.
Yeah.
All right, thank you all for coming here today, this afternoon. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sid Ropp. Dr. Ropp is the host of Gnostic podcast called Gnostic Insights. Sid is the author of A Simple Explanation of Absolutely Everything and The Gnostic Gospel Illuminated, and several other books. She is also the editor, book designer, and publisher of numerous novels and memoirs. Her long-running blog, A Simple Explanation, has been active for over 12 years and boasts about 305,000 views. Dr. Ropp holds advanced degrees in classical rhetoric, education, and counseling, as well as a bachelor's degree in psychology. Her doctoral specialty is the rhetoric of science and medicine. And now, Dr. Ropp.
Thank you. Today, this is going to be like a roller coaster ride because we're going to take a gigantic ride through two tremendously large cosmologies. One, a secular cosmology that I designed, a theory of everything called A Simple Explanation of Absolutely Everything. And the other one is based upon Gnostic scriptures called the Nag Hammadi, and in particular, the tripartite tractate of the Nag Hammadi. By the way, P.S., we're going to change this slide so it's got my book title instead of An Ancient Gnostic Gospel. Okay. Both the Simple Explanation and the Gnostic Gospel are based upon the one core principle called the Simple Golden Rule. And I've rewritten the Golden Rule. It's not do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It is this: units of consciousness hold hands with others like themselves and work together on projects for the common good. And here are examples. It doesn't matter what size the unit of consciousness is. It could be a neuron, it could be people or cells in our bodies. When I first wrote the Simple Explanation, I also thought that units of consciousness extended down to particles, atoms, and molecules. But as we'll find out today, there's a reason why I now have decided that isn't right anymore, and I've changed the Simple Explanation. Thank you. Teammates, whether they're cells or people or trees in the forest, whatever, they share information, they share assistance, and they share love in order to focus on a project that none of them could accomplish on their own. This puts the project at the center of their combined concentration. And the focus is on the project and not on themselves. And this is how it results in the betterment of all. And this is an example of the men putting up the barn, which obviously no man could do by himself. Another principle to the Simple Golden Rule is that it's how everything in our universe is organized. And by the way, this is something that I came up with in the Simple Explanation of Absolutely Everything. So if what I tell you today seems unfamiliar or odd, it really is. It is a paradigm shifting way to think about creation and our material world. So everything in the world, from the particles all the way up, is organized in this pyramidal fashion, with the higher, the fewer. So units of consciousness down here combine and they hold up the next level of units of consciousness, and on and on and on, up to the pinnacle. So that's the principle called the higher, the fewer. Now here is one of the basic concepts in the Simple Explanation of Absolutely Everything. One of the principles of the Simple Explanation is that our universe is toroidal. It's based on this pattern of a torus. And a torus is a donut, simply. And I hope that you can see that this is a representation of a torus. And in the simple explanation, I called the background creative consciousness of which we are a part. No, we might have to move.
We'll watch
Yeah,
we should move.
them.
Okay.
We'll watch them.
All right. Dog going after sandwiches. Tape. The metaverse is the matrix of consciousness, the background matrix of consciousness, the ground state of everybody and everything in our universe is consciousness itself. This is a concept that is for spiritually minded people. Most materialists, most scientists, they think consciousness is simply a byproduct of the brain. They think consciousness is just a byproduct of the meat of the brain, and they completely discount it as being its own type of principle. But in the simple explanation, the metaverse is consciousness itself. And then the metaverse has a thought. And the metaverse turned inward on that thought, kind of threw a bubble up around the thought, and that became our universe. So the Big Bang, where does the Big Bang come from? That starts from a single point and expands outward to the size of our universe now? It came from the thought of the metaverse. And it starts at the middle and it pushes out. And this is what creates time, change, space, and position. This is our material universe. And it also creates individuated consciousness, or I call them units of consciousness. So the metaverse is one giant field of consciousness, but each unit of consciousness is a fractal of the whole. And a fractal is I should ask you guys, do you know what fractals are? Yeah,
I don't know
maybe
if I
not.
could describe it. But
Okay, but a fractal it's called a repeating pattern at higher and lower scales. And the best example of a fractal is a head of broccoli. Because if you take that broccoli, and I use this example because everyone knows broccoli, and if you break off one of those flowers from the broccoli, it looks very much like that original flower. And you can then break off another flower off of that. It looks just like those two. And I've done this as an experiment, which you can see on YouTube. Down to the 7th iteration, you can keep peeling off an ordinary piece of broccoli at least to 7 iterations, and those are all fractals. And so we are fractals of this gigantic universal consciousness. And the thing that holds it together, love, coherence, attraction pushes in, and the repulsive force creates the time, space, and material. Okay? So as of 2012, when I wrote a simple explanation of absolutely everything, this is what the basic diagram looked like. And it starts with quantum particles, and quantum foam is the smallest iteration of material in our universe. This is a scientific principle, but it's chaotic. And it doesn't begin to form itself into shapes or particles until it rises up. So the quantum foam is, and that's why it's called foam, because it's just roiling chaos. It starts at the bottom. And then out of that, it levels up to atomic particles and waves. And then they level up to atoms. And see, the atoms hold hands and level up to molecules. And you can see how everything reaches out to others like itself and levels up to the next size. The molecules level up and become the elements on the periodic table. The elements level up and become minerals and mineral aggregations. And every time you level up, it's the higher the fewer. Because there's several, even a H2O particle, there's one H and two O's, but they make only one molecule of water. So it's always the higher the fewer. And so these are organized knots of forces leveling up to create the material universe. And then we jump to the living things, and each one of these, beginning with the organelles, they hold hands. These are the interior parts of the cells. They become the cells. And then the cells in our bodies, they hold hands and they become the organs. but always with their own kind. So the skin cells hold hands with other skin cells and become skin. The heart cells hold hands with heart cells and become hearts, etc. And all of the organs level up and become organ systems, and it's the organ systems that become organisms. So everything levels up in this higher, the fewer pattern, and that's why it's triangular shape, because this is the shape of a hierarchy. And the job of the living creatures is to sustain life, and so it's a really good thing that you see, we tend to think of ourselves as a singular self, but when you think about it, there are countless billions of selves inside of you, and their entire job is to keep your body alive and walking around. They're dedicated to you. So yourself that you think of as your name, as yourself, is kind of like the God of your body in its own hierarchical aggregation. And this is why it's important to be kind to your body, because it's not just a nothing. It's not your body. You are the governing ruler of all these billions of creatures depending upon you to feed them and to breathe and to be kind. So when we get up to the self, you see, that is what in yoga is known as the discriminating intelligence. I call it the governing unit of consciousness. And then above ourselves is the universal unit of consciousness. At least as of 2012, this is the pattern. And it all keeps replicating this higher, the fewer pattern. So here's what it looked like originally, and I call the bottom part mud, and I call our living part meat, because there's definitely a difference between mud and meat. Mud is the elemental material level, and the meat is everything alive, not just animals, but includes bacteria, plants, flowers, fishes, all of that. So the mud is organized by the universal unit of consciousness, pushing upward from the quantum foam and organizing everything as it goes up. But it stops at the level of the minerals. The living parts of us, so we're made up of these molecules. We know that we have all of these various molecules, and that is part of the mud. But our living part, our soft and squishy part, is the meat. And it is organized by that golden rule of cooperation. And the meat is organized from that metaversal consciousness downward, whereas the elements are organized from the universal unit of consciousness upward. So here we have the one, life, consciousness, and this is organizing everything from the top down. So even though the cells hold hands, the organs hold hands, the organ systems hold hands to become that organism, it's top down though, which means that it certainly implies that life begins at conception, because it's at conception that that organism is designed, and it is what's organizing everything else. So it's spirit down, and the mud is mud up. And then I read the tripartite tractate in the Nag Hammadi, and this happened in 2015, 3 years after I wrote the simple explanation. Now, this is the entire cosmogony of the universe in one picture. And don't worry if you don't memorize it or don't follow it, but I suspect that you will all recognize it, because part of the claim of the Gnostic Gospels is that we are all born with this knowledge preloaded. That is the gnosis. We are already acquainted, but we tend to forget about it. So let's just take a fun ride through the cosmology of the universe according to Valentinian Gnosticism. So that now we want to think of this black background as that metaverse we talked about before. And in Gnostic books, that's called the Father. Then the Father had a thought. So far it sounds a lot like the simple explanation, but instead of calling it the universal unit of consciousness, the Father's thought is called the Son. So there you have the Son of God. Huh. The moment the Son emerged from the Father, like a bucket dipped in the sea of consciousness, it contains exactly the same material as the sea, but it is constrained. It is contained in a size, in a monad kind of form. And that is the Son compared to the Father. The Son is exactly the same material and knows everything the Father knows, but it's relatable because it's a singular unit as opposed to just this amorphous, everywhere kind of thought. The moment the Son differentiated out of the Father, the Son differentiated into himself. And this is called the all, because it is all of the variables contained in the Son. This is an infinite number of variables because, of course, the Son is an encapsulation of the infinite sea of consciousness. So imagine that the all is like the rays of a sun emerging out of this S-O-N. And this is like an S-U-N. And then the Gnostic Gospel says that the moment the eon, or the moment that the fullness became aware of its own existence, they immediately broke out of sitting in one place like this, and they, I don't know if you can see it from where you are, but they swam over, they migrated, they rolled themselves up into a ball, and they immediately sorted themselves into a hierarchy.
What's they?
Yeah.
The fullnesses, they're called the entireties, or the fullnesses.
Okay.
Each one of these rays is an independent entity.
Oh, all right.
And all of them together
helpful.
make up the mind of God.
Okay,
Okay,
that's
I should
helpful.
say that.
Yeah.
Okay. The minute they recognize themselves as independent entities and not just merely this smudge of the sun, they migrated and made themselves into a hierarchy. Interestingly enough. And this now is no longer called the fullness. This is called the fullness of God. This is the all, this is the fullness of God. I said that backwards. So this shape, you'll recognize from the simple explanation as well, it's a hierarchy. And when the fullnesses sorted themselves into the hierarchy, they gave themselves, they named themselves, they gave themselves jobs, they gave themselves a position in the hierarchy, and they still sat as one, but now they are all in a hierarchy. So it's the higher the fewer idea. And this little bubble here, this is paradise. Because what the fullnesses do in the fullness of God is dream of paradise. They're like writers. They dream up what's coming. They're screenwriters. And the screenplay is called Paradise. The very last eon to have been born into the fullness, the last one to make it over, he was called Logos, or Logos, L-O-G-O-S. And he had within his singular body fractals of all the rest of, these are now called eons, A-E-O-N-S. He had fractals of all the other eons contained within his body. Whereas these are singularities, these are like round monads, like spores. He was shaped like the hierarchy, and he had the entire fullness of God inside himself, but at a fractal scale. He was not equal to all of this. He was a fractal level down, like peeling a branch off of the broccoli. And sitting up there all by himself, he didn't see the other eons around him. If you're sitting at the top of a hierarchy and you look around, it looks like you're all around. It looks like you're all alone. Whereas these guys know they're plugged into a group. He thought he was all alone up there. And since he had all the parts of the hierarchy, he thought he was all there was. And he launched himself up to plug himself back into the metaverse, to plug himself back into the fullness of God. He left the unity of the, this is also called the pleroma. That's another word for the fullness of God. It means the everything. He launched himself up and then he fell. And this is the fall. The fall isn't when Eve gives the apple to Adam. The fall is when Logos launches himself up. He can't attain God. He falls. And that is the prototypical fall. And when he falls, he breaks apart. And again, you'll be able to see this better on the slides. All of his parts, all of these pieces, they roll out of him. And Logos, it says that the better part of Logos was horrified at what had happened. Horrified, because the things that rolled out of Logos after the fall were chaotic, disordered, stupid, small, knowing nothing, remembering nothing, not knowing the fullness or the Son or the Father from which they came. Total amnesia. He was horrified, and so he hightailed it back to the fullness. But he abandoned the deficiency. This now becomes known as the deficiency or the imitation. And in Jungian terms, these are the shadows. So since the body of Logos had all the parts of the fullness, after it broke and fell apart, all the smaller fractal pieces, they are like the fullnesses. They're like the eons, but they're a fractal level small, and they're broken and disordered. And because they came out of disobedience, they came out of an egoic move. See, this is the mind of God here when it all sits together. This is that one self. But the thing that launched itself away from them, that was the first action of ego. And these all come from that egoic or presumptuous thought, is how they put it in the tripartite tractate. The Father threw up a boundary around the deficiency to contain it. And that was not only to keep the little bits of the shadows from rolling out into the fullness, but it was because you need a boundary in order to make what's called an economy. And that's another thought that's put out in the Gnostic Gospels. And an economy is simply an ecology. Just imagine if we all were wandering around and there was no such thing as boundaries or spaces or places. How would we ever hook up with one another? How would we ever instantiate the golden rule? How would we hold hands to level up? There's no boundary. It requires a boundary to have an ecology. And so the boundary was put around the deficiency. And then Logos up here, along with the fullness, they prayed for some help to come to the deficiency because Logos is now fractured. He's broken in two. Logos has gone up here, but he's gone up here in this broken form. And he's left half of himself behind. So they want to pull all this, they want to save all this and bring it back up to make the pleroma whole again and to make Logos in particular whole again. They want to reincorporate the ego of Logos back into the self. You know, we all have the one self that is a mirror of the fullness of God or a mirror of the Father or our discriminating intelligence, but we all also have an ego, and that's the part that wanders off and is self-serving. The ego does not know about the golden rule. The ego has nothing to do with reaching out to help others and to focus on something other than itself for the betterment of all. The ego's job for us is to take care of our body, to make sure we are fed, to make sure we are safe, and to heck with everything else. And that's what happened when Logos fell. that is when ego split off and became a separate entity. So up here, the fractured logos, half of logos is back up here. It cooks up the scheme to save the deficiency and sends down these guys, and these are called the second order of powers. And everything alive is a second order of power. You and me and the dog and the plants and the cells, everything that makes up that meat level, these are the second order powers. And that is how it is that the Holy Spirit, or the fullness of God, infuses life into what is otherwise a dead and empty material existence. And a tragic thing occurred, though. The plan was that all the second order powers were going to come in, move into the universe, co-occupy that material physicality that that had been created by the fall. And it was through our, how our bodies are made up of particles and material, but also living things. It's the bringing them together that is the redemption of the fall. So the idea was that all these second order powers, one for every one of these little guys that rolled out, a second order power came in, carrying the Holy Spirit along with. And the idea was we were going to have a sweet talking to and give them kisses and love, and then everybody could go back to heaven because they'd all be redeemed. But guess what happened? We forgot our mission, and we became entangled in what is called the never-ending war. And that is why I've represented it as the yin and yang. So we living creatures are the yang force, and the deficiency is the yin force. And so we're chasing each other in a never-ending war. We have wars against death. We have wars against entropy. We have wars against each other because who's right and who's wrong. We have war against virtue versus vice. Everything we do is a battle. And we were given this ability to be warriors, but we were supposed to do the battle with love. Our weapon was supposed to be love, but instead we've picked up hatchets and we've begun lopping off heads. So that didn't work. Then the fullness petitioned God singly and altogether. They and the Son petitioned the entire metaverse to give blessing to a Savior. Help us, we can't do this. Turns out the second order powers couldn't do it. Even though, by the way, we are stronger, we are more able and capable than the deficiency, than the imitations. These are called the imitations of the deficiency, because each one of them, remember, is a fractal imitation of one of the fullnesses, of one of the eons. But they're way down here. They're not only smaller, but they're broken. Whereas we are the children of the eons. We are the fruit of the eons. So we are blessed. We are not accidents. We were planned children, whereas this one was an accident. And we are full of the Holy Spirit. So we are actually one or two orders above the deficiency. So we have more power in us. So that's what it means when, like the Christians say, there is more power in you and the Holy Spirit than in the demons in hell. And that is a fact. But because we've forgotten our mission, we keep chasing our tails. So they petitioned God, and all of them together, and each one of them singly, they sang this song, and guess what came out of that? The Christ. So this is known as the Christ in Valentinian Gnosticism. So this is yet another entity coming down into creation, and its job is to, once again, rectify the fall, but now it's got to rectify us too, because we have forgotten who we are. And so we will be the first ones to remember, and then once we remember, then with the help of the Christ, with the help of the Savior who is coming to save creation, we can save all of the deficiency. And once that happens, then everything can be peachy keen, and it rolls back up and becomes the paradise again. And this is what in my imagination, this is what is called the final economy. And this is what happens after the Christ comes and rectifies everything. That pleroma that we were looking at, the hierarchy of the pleroma, or also known as the fullness of God, here it is in close-up. All right, it follows the golden rule, right? All right, it follows the golden rule. Now you can see that Logos looks a lot like this guy. Yeah. So everything in the pleroma levels up. I don't know why that slide is there just like that. I think I'm going to change this. Now, okay. What I didn't tell you, what I should have told you on that overall slide, it's okay, is that when the containment was put up around the deficiency, that ecology down there has a God that is not the Father, the Son, or the fullness of God. That God is called the Demiurge. And it is the God of the material world. The Demiurge is the God that levels up from the bottom. So what I was calling the universal unit of consciousness in Gnosticism, they call it the Demiurge. And you know what they call it in Christianity? And here's one of the great heresies of Gnosticism. This is Yahweh. This is Jehovah. This is the God of the Old Testament. So this is why the Gnostics were all killed out around 300 AD, and why the books were all burned, because the Catholic Church and the Pope, or rather the Emperor of Rome, wanted the Demiurge to be the God, because then they could work for the Demiurge. They were already working for the Demiurge, so they called him God. But that is an error. The Demiurge is not a top-down guy. He's a bottom-up guy. So he took the quantum chaos from the fall, which was the body of the broken Logos, which is now the Demiurge, and he levels up the particles, level ups the atoms, level up the molecules, levels up the elements and minerals. But it turns out it's not according to the golden rule, and that was the mistake I made in the simple explanation. I thought everything reached out and held hands. I used to give consciousness to the atoms and the molecules. But according to the Gnostic gospel, these are not conscious. These are the imitations of the fall, and they did not exist from the beginning. There is no consciousness in the Demiurge, because the Demiurge isn't the self, it's the ego. And the ego is not conscious. It is merely a mechanism, a self-serving mechanism. So we're leveling up at the material level. And the way that the Demiurge controls the material level, it's not through the golden rule. He's a puppet master. The Demiurge strictly controls matter via strings of power. The mud is set into motion by chemical and physical bonds, right? That's what they call them in science. That's what they call them in chemistry. Here's your bonds, here's your valences. Well, those are the strings of the Demiurge. Mud has no free will. Mud only works at the behest of the Demiurge. And the Demiurge also has some evil angels. The Christians would think of them fallen angels, but they're not angels. They are called archons in this type of Valentinian Gnosticism. So mud has no free will, is controlled by direct strings and valences by the Demiurge and the archons. The archons are creations of the Demiurge. They are ethereal beings that are not material. They're like angels. They're like anti-angels.
Okay.
They're anti-angels. They didn't fall from heaven, though. They were never up in the pleroma.
Kind of power?
Yes, they do.
Uh-huh.
Let me tell you about that then. Let me tell you about archons a little bit.
That might be.
All right. Okay. The archons they are his helpers. They do the bidding of the Demiurge. Okay, so he's the great God walking around. And the God in the Old Testament that won walks around and squats by the fire and has arguments with Satan over whether or not they can make Job fall. That isn't the Father. That isn't the Father that Christ referred to. You know, my Father in heaven, that's not him. It's the Demiurge. Because the Demiurge does roam about the land. The archons are immaterial. They're ethereal creations that are doing his bidding, and I think that there are archons attached to every nefarious thing in this world. I think that there are archons in charge of frustrating you when you didn't save in time while you're working on your PC, and I think there are archons attached to each kind of virus. So there is a corona archon, and there's a herpes archon, and there's a SARS archon, and there is archons that cover every addiction. There's meth archons and heroin archons. Every nefarious thing that is, the Demiurge doesn't love us, by the way. I don't know if you know, I guess I didn't make that point.
The negative.
Yeah,
It's good to say
the
that.
Demiurge
Yeah.
hates us,
Yeah.
particularly because we come from God.
Yeah.
And the Demiurge hates everything having to do with God or goodness or the golden rule. You know, he has absolute disdain for any of that. The Demiurge is certainly an atheist, except he thinks what? There is no God but me, he said in the Old Testament. So,
Oh, yeah.
he's a jealous God. I am a jealous God. Well, hello, are you an egoic God? Yes, you are. If you go back and look in the Old Testament, all the things that Jehovah says, it's all self-centered egoism.
Yeah.
And bad and mean, and I'm going to kill the firstborn of the Egyptians, and I want you to go in and rape and pillage the Canaanites and all this. So that is all evil. And the archons are meant to be devilish. So in the old Dark Ages thought of having devils and angels, it's kind of back to the Dark Ages here. And there are archons in charge of bedeviling us.
For sure.
So here now, having learned all of that, here is the final simple explanation of absolutely everything, which I came up with this year. So you'll see it's the familiar triangle, and we have the bottom down here of the particles, waves, aggregations, and minerals. And now I realize this is not the universal unit of consciousness, because it turns out the Demiurge isn't even conscious. He has complete amnesia. He's a controlling force. He's all about power. He's a force. He doesn't remember, though. So this is the material organized by the bonds of the Demiurge. And then we all, second order powers here in the green space, these are the living second order powers. Everything that's alive on the planet coming from the top down, coming from the metaversal consciousness on down. And we are married right here to the material world while we are in this particular economy. This is called the second economy. It's the second order powers. So, and by the way, FYI, this is being redesigned so this writing's in black, so it'll be a lot easier to see. This was an accident. Okay. So, this is organized from the Demiurge up, and he's pulling strings, but this is all organized from the top down, as we learned before. And these are groups of units of consciousness working together as similar cells in a common purpose. Here are organ systems working together. Here is our governing unit of consciousness, and everything on the planet, every living thing on the planet, even bacteria, have a governing unit of consciousness. They are all parts of the second order power. We are all the fruit of the fullness of God, the fruit of the pleroma. Viruses, by the way, are not alive.
Yeah, that's what they say.
Viruses are demiurgic. And that's why they are run by archons. But bacteria are living creatures because they procreate. Procreation is one of the things that shows you that what the difference between a living organism and things that aren't alive. So another implication, aside from the differences between viruses and bacteria, not alive, well, will AI ever be alive? What do you think?
No.
No, because it's elemental. It's built from the circuits on up, and it's controlled by archons. Will robots be alive? No. It doesn't matter how conscious they seem or if they can pass the Turing test. They're just very clever archons.
That makes perfect sense.
Yes.
Makes perfect sense.
So, once we get above the organism level, we continue, we human levels at least, we continue to level up in the form of societal. We keep going up even though it's no longer part of our bodies. We hold hands and work on group projects, work projects, or houses and architecture, or any other societal, cultural artifacts can either be made in the Golden Rule fashion, like the Amish putting up that barn, or they could be made in the not Golden Rule fashion by humans that have forgotten their role in the universe and they're doing the bidding of the Demiurge, like dirty movies or whatever. That's a product, that's not of God. So anything that encourages vice, Breaking Bad is of the Demiurge.
Definitely.
So these are other levels that go up. We have a global level that continues to level up, and that is the transpersonal consciousness. The archetypal level, where the archetypes are. That is the global level. There's an astronomical level, which are galactic forces at cosmic scale. These are, the reason I made these part gold and part dark is that when you think about the products of the Demiurge, it's not only the smallest particles, but it's everything that's not living. So that includes planets, the rocky part of the planets. But any life forms over them, those are second order powers, and that probably goes throughout the whole universe. If there's life anywhere else than Earth, and there may well be, they're all going to follow this same pattern because this is universal. And then what is the universal you see up here? That is the consciousness of this material part of the universe, our good old Taurus here. But it is the Demiurge, and once all this levels up, then he will be able to rejoin the metaversal consciousness and the pleroma. Was there one more? Oh, here is one more, sorry. And then according to the Gnostic Gospel, this is the final, called the final economy. And so, the second order powers, which is all of us on all of our planets, we are the called. We are the ones that are being called. The still small voice of God trying to ask us to do the right thing. That is the called. And we will all eventually accept salvation and redemption because we want to. That's where we came from. That's home. A lot of people have forgotten that. And some people have forgotten it entirely and they reject it entirely. But the great thing about the Gnostic Gospel is that nobody's going to hell. The only things that are going to hell are the phantoms of the imitation of the outer darkness. This is called Hades, and it is out here, but they never existed from the beginning anyway. These are the shadows of the eons. So they have no independent existence. When the Demiurge packs up and leaves and rejoins the pleroma, they will disappear, just like flipping on a light switch makes your shadow disappear.
So the Demiurge will join us.
He will rejoin. We're trying to save the Demiurge.
I thought the Demiurge had
No consciousness.
Yeah.
He is egoic, but he is the ego of Logos.
Oh yeah.
So and I should say this, good point. All of the fullnesses or the eons of the pleroma, they must have an ego, but their ego is not self-centered. Their ego is simply their name.
Self-consciousness.
Yes, it's self-consciousness and what their name is and where they live and what their job is and who their neighbors are, what their responsibilities are. So the ego does pre-exist and it exists in heaven, but it's not self-centered. It's golden rule.
Okay.
Self-identity.
Yes, it is simply good. I like that.
Wi-
Simply
Within
self-identity.
a larger context.
Within the larger
The
context.
whole.
Exactly, always
Okay,
within the
so
larger
not-
context of the whole.
not-
Not all by themselves.
Right,
No, they're
action
always, they've never left that pleroma.
Okay,
And
that's,
the Demiurge is the ego of Logos. of the self of Logos. And so he will rejoin Logos. And then finally, the fullness will be complete again. And these up here, these are called the elect, or the third order of powers, which will come into being in the final economy. And these are spiritual entities called the pre-existent church. They're also called the elect. They are possibly saints or bodhisattvas in other traditions, but they were never caught in the war. They never lost themselves in the fight. They have always remained plugged into the top. And that is where Christ is the king. And this is known as the final economy. And once we're all up there, we're all going to be sitting there
Right. that was
in
my
paradise.
question.
We'll be sitting there dreaming together of
We're all
paradise.
going to be coming up into the.
We're still living in here because that's our cohort.
But
Because
we are going up.
we're all going up.
Yeah.
We are all going up to an ethereal plane, and this is ethereal. This is no longer material. The material is left behind.
Mm-hmm.
And so up here, this is when that paradise that the eons were dreaming of before the fall, it is instantiated in all of us. So this is that vision of heaven that pretty much every human on the planet has a sense of. That is why we are so disappointed with life on Earth. Why should we be disappointed with life on Earth unless we think and expect that there's a better life somewhere else? Well, what gave us that idea? Well, it's pre-existent and we're returning to it. And so that is the final outcome known as the final economy. Okay. Oh, move this. All right. Oh, there it is, the final economy and the Gnostic Gospel Illuminated.
Wow.
The end. Okay, stop that tape.
Wow.
How long did that last, I wonder?
The tape will tell.
That was 47 minutes.
Well, that is just perfect.
Perfect.
For a